Good morning and welcome to yet another episode of Coffee with Mr. V. And in order to, what we're going to do today is just a very quick episode on the long run aggregate supply curve in order to build on what we've just been doing with the classical model and the short run aggregate supply curve. So very quickly then, let's just go through the routine. Go and grab yourself a coffee so that you've got something to fuel yourself while we go through this 10-minute video or otherwise. If you don't like coffee, go and put your favorite liquid in another mug, glass, or cup. And then with me, we will do the synchronized sip. And that is going to be the best part of your day. So here we go. 1, 2, 3. Love coffee. So long run aggregate supply. Okay, very quickly then, as a little recap, let's just remind ourselves of the classical story with the short run AS curve and the aggregate demand curve, because that's going to be useful of how we can illustrate or identify, explain the long run aggregate supply curve. What we said was the assumption is that in the classical model that the equilibrium is at YFE. And then if the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left, for example, demand for goods and services goes down, demand for labor goes down, wages goes down, costs of production go down, and therefore the short run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right when costs of production fall, and therefore we end up back at YFE. So our direction of travel there was A, B, C, and we came back to YFE. And you'll also remember from the last time that we did shifts in short run aggregate supply, or the classical story rather, if AD shifts to the right, then we also come back to YFE as well. Remember that YFE is meant to represent full capacity, meant to represent the PPF. So if we are always coming back to YFE, whether AD goes to the left or whether AD goes to the right, and in that one we would go to point D and then to point E, we're always coming back here. And so what we say is, in the long run, we are always coming back to somewhere on that line there, the long run aggregate supply. In the long run, the short run aggregate supply will move to counteract the effects of the demand curve, and we will always end up back at YFE. So in the long run, we're always ending up back at YFE. So instead of doing that every time, we can just draw our vertical straight line long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, now this has similarities with part of the Keynesian AS curve. Okay, the Keynesian AS curve is kind of very slightly upward sloping here, nearly horizontal, but not quite, very slightly upward sloping. Then there's the curvy bit, and then there's this vertical bit also at YFE. And that's because Keynes did buy into the argument that at full capacity, at the PPF, when we had run out of spare resources, that actually it doesn't matter if you get any more increase in aggregate demand, that you would just stop at maximum output. Okay, but if you remember rightly from our previous work, Keynes argued that you could have a negative output gap in the long run, and hence why you have that section, which is actually the short run AS curve from the classical model below YFE, but it just doesn't extend beyond YFE, but you get this vertical point there. So with the classical diagram, okay, with our long run aggregate supply curve then, you have no mechanism to show changes in costs of production. That is purely done on short run aggregate supply. And that's why I have made the link between short run aggregate supply and the kind of the horizontally bit of the Keynesian model. You can't show anything here about cost of production, just like you can't with the PPF. With the PPF, there is no mechanism to show price changes. There's no mechanism to show cost of production changes, wages changes, or anything like that. Okay, the only thing that shifts the PPF outwards are the quantity of resources or the productivity of resources, sometimes known as the quality of resources. Okay, those are the two things that also would shift the SRAS curve. Okay, I'll write in. it's the quality of the resources or productivity of resources. Those resources, again, land, labor, or capital. Okay, it doesn't matter what order you ever do them in. In fact, normally you would do it capital, labor, land. For those of you that care about this sort of stuff, K, L, and N. Capital, labor, and land, and income is a function of those things. Now that's kind of undergraduate, starting to look at undergraduate type of economics. You don't need that for A-level, but I'm just showing it to you anyway. So why am I doing this part here is because ultimately, if you're a classical economist, the only way that you can get permanent, long-run economic growth, the only way that you can shift real GDP to the right in the long run, remember, not in the short run, in the long run, is if you do one of these things. If you try and just do demand-side policies to stimulate GDP in the short run, you're always going to come back to the long-run aggregate supply. So therefore, the only way to get real long-term GDP growth is to actually shift the long-run aggregate supply curve to the right, in the same way that you would shift the PPF to the right. And here we go, we've now got YFE2 or YFE dash. Okay, so what sorts of things then shift the long-run aggregate supply side? It's not cost of production, but what it is quality and productivity of resources. Or, because you've done this in previous lessons, it's your supply side policies. It's those policies that are aimed at either increasing the quality or the productivity of resources in the economy. So to look at some of those from the specification, if I look at the A-level specification, the supply side says to increase incentives. So I guess, for example, they would argue that any workplace incentives, such as decreasing unemployment benefits, such as decreasing income tax, that would make more people willing and able to work. So therefore you would increase the size of the labor force and the, wow, I've made a big error there. I'm really sorry about that. I've only just spotted it. Or the quantity of the labor resource in the economy. Another one might be to improve the skills and the quality of the labor force through something like education and training. So if you increase the level of education and training into a particular economy, if people now have more skills, you would argue that their productivity, their rate of output per person, or their rate of output per worker has increased, and therefore the maximum level of output has increased as well. LRAS shifts to the right. Finally, another one might be some sort of privatization or deregulation policy, increasing the amount of competition in markets. If you do that, and those of you that have studied theory of the firm will know that there is now an incentive for firms to become more dynamically efficient, more productively efficient, and therefore to try and produce more output per machine, more output per worker, and they are driven by that profit motive and that competition between firms in markets. Okay, there's lots of other supply side policies. That's not meant to be an exhaustive list, but this is the opportunity now for you to go and recap those supply side policies and make sure that you're happy. Okay, supply side policies, in order to be a supply side policy, they must either do one of those two things. They must either increase the quantity of resources in the economy or the productivity of those resources. So when you talk about a supply side policy, you must talk about which one they're doing, and you must talk about them in terms of shifting the long run AS curve to the right. Right, that's it. That was a very quick one today. Cheers. I look forward to seeing you in our next remote lesson. Cheers then. Bye.